Hi, I'm John DeArmond with the Coquille Valley Sword Group, and today we're talking about Article 5, the gait. So, let's begin. The gait. With regard to the gait during combat, irrespective of whether you make big or small, quick or slow steps, the accustomed gait should be adhered to. Such unreliable specific ways of walking as flowing, gliding, stamping, creeping, as well as forwards or backwards gaits, are all to be avoided. However difficult the ground may be, you should tread confidently. This will become more understandable later. So, we're talking about how we walk, how we move, the feet specifically. And it's kind of controversial. In that Musashi's basically saying here, all of these sophisticated stepping motions, some of which represent the foundational strategy of other styles, are just to be avoided, right? Just throw them out. They're no good. Now in the Gorin no Sho, he goes into in the Book of Air or tradition, he goes through each of these methods kind of individually and talks about why they're bad, why we don't use them, and sort of the disarray that can come from using them. But that still doesn't necessarily explain why he advocates to just walk normally, right? And that comes back down to this idea that how you are in normal life should not be different from how you are in fighting fundamentally, right? And of course, walking is no exception to this. When you have to be put into a sort of high-stress situation, you want your motions to be comfortable for your body. You don't want to spend your thinking power deciding, am I going to step with, kuriashi or whatever, right? You just want to walk normally, walk up to the dude and cut him down, right? So, this idea of just walking normally is pretty conducive to, the other elements of our strategy. Let's look at some of the finer points he mentions. Treading confidently. What does this mean? People oftentimes, when they're fighting, when they're working, right, because they're a little reticent about getting hit in the face, tend to bring their mind and their awareness up top, right? And the lower half of their body sort of loses intensity, right? Awareness. And this is a really large mistake. I mean, you wouldn't want to say, I have an army of 100,000 people, right? I'm going to focus on 50,000 of them, and they're going to do all the work while this other 50,000 just kind of like meanders thoughtlessly behind the first, right? When it comes time to try and utilize that second half of strength, you're not going to be able to if you've sort of neglected it. And this treading confidently is kind of an admonition to just be mindful of your feet, right? And don't just step because you have to. Step with intent, step with purpose. Let it really drive your work and drive your body. Now, while the Heiho Sanjuko Kajo leaves, how you go about that, just vague, as though to say, you already know how to walk, you don't have to do anything special. The Goran No Show in the water book goes into a little bit more detail. Just to say that you should have the toes slightly floating and that you should tread firmly with the heel. Now, this walking method is, or rather the quality of general motion in that walking method, which is to say sort of this heel toe with the toes slightly floating, is not uncommon in Japanese swordsmanship, and is most likely kind of an affect to develop, or that was developed in response to the type of footwear that they wore. You know, if you were to walk sort of heel, toe, and then throw your heel up, the back of your sandals, right, are just going to be chucking mud up the back of your legs, up the back of your hakama, and you know, this is kind of to be avoided. It's rude. It's like you want mud flaps on the back of your truck so you're not kicking dirt into other people. And so this is just this way of walking really developed sort of naturalistically, not because of any specific combative advantage. That being said, if you're sort of unfamiliar with this walking method and you just read the words, you know, lift the toes, tread with the heel, you can get a lot of sort of mistaken ideas about what this means. So let's start with the toes, right? People have this idea that if this is the floor and this is my foot, that to have the toes slightly lifted means that I engage the sort of muscles and some sort of mechanical process to manually lift the toes. This is not the case. Instead, what we're doing is we're just not applying pressure with the toes into the ground. Our foot is flat on the floor, but you could easily slide a piece of paper underneath the toes, right? Because they aren't pressed in. That is sort of what we're getting at when we're saying the toes float. Now, on the opposite end of that, treading with the heel, people read that and they go, oh, he's talked about the toes, he says they're up, he talks about the heels, and it treads in, so obviously we must be walking like this, right? We hit on the heel and just kind of like balance on it or pin it to the ground with the rest of the foot floating. And this is, of course, ridiculous. That's not at all how it's done. Instead, we get this position and we drive that heel in, right? Boom. And it rolls so that our weight is just behind the ball of the foot, right? So from the heel, it engages the floor, whoop, and the weight centralizes. That way, we're in the middle of the structure of the foot and we've got the most stability. Again, this heel treading is a result of just practical walking, right? If you're the kind of person that sort of like drags your toes, you know, you can do that in shoes. But imagine walking barefoot in concrete. And in fact, walking barefoot on concrete is a good way to kind of observe how your footwork is in the beginning. Because most of us are not very aware of how our feet move, how we distribute weight. You know, are you an edge walker? Are you heel? Do you walk on your toes? Are you an instep walker? You know, or is your foot cammed exteriorly or interiorly? So walking barefoot on concrete can help you sort of suss that out because you pay more attention to it, right? Because it's uncomfortable for most people. It's kind of an abnormal behavior. And if you end up doing things like toe dragging, you'll be educated really quickly as to why this is not useful. And then be able to sort of extrapolate that beyond the sort of sterility of a perfectly flat surface and go, okay, well, if I'm going through, and I'm fighting in the woods, the mud, or a creek bed or whatever, I don't want my toes down to be caught and snagged up on every little sort of irregularity on the floor. I want to be able to sort of glide in, mount it firmly. So even if I've come to an oddly shaped object, I can land on it, and establish purchase until I have the opportunity to move again to sort of improve that foot structure. Overall, the idea of stepping in our style is not really sophisticated. It's not very special, right? You just walk normally in a healthy manner, and you'll get it. Now, I mentioned the book of Air tradition. In that, sort of in the last section of where he's talking about footwork and other styles, he reminds us that everything we do in single-person combat, matches, large-scale conflict, and he uses footwork as an example of this, about how when people tend to step thoughtlessly, oftentimes they will throw themselves into disarray, right? They step, and with each step they corrupt their posture a little bit. They feel themselves behind time, or they feel themselves losing their good kamae, and they try and rush to sort of catch it before it falls away, which just leads to their work breaking apart. And so he really admonishes us to just move enough, right? You don't have to try to move fast. Sometimes you move fast because you're moving in harmony with the opponent. But as always, going fast for fast's sake is not part of our strategy, and it's not part of good fighting strategy. In the same way that moving thoughtlessly is not really part of our strategy. It's a lot like that age-old pistol shooting adage, right? You can't miss fast enough to hit a target. So taking a bunch of thoughtless steps is not going to bring you closer to victory. But more often than not, making your intentional step, right? And going, I want to be here on purpose, is what makes it easy for you to end the fight in sort of one time, right? To bring it to a close as quickly as possible, which is of course our goal, right? We don't want to prolong the fight, because that, becomes bad for us, for everyone. So that's Article 5, the gait. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. There are lots of ways to practice it. As always, play around with it. And if you want to understand, you got to pick up a sword and go train.